Welcome to Trauma Talk. I'm Cheryl, a teacher, hypnobirthing teacher, doula and birth keeper, and if you don't know me already, I love talking about trauma, but in particular birth trauma, even though it's all linked together. And that's what this podcast is for, to talk about trauma, to talk about birth trauma, and explore how that all links together. I'm not from a clinical background and I don't have a medical degree, but I'm talking from the point of view of human experience, my own human experience, and the things that I've learned and the experiences of those who I've been lucky enough to support in their journeys to, more often than not, a healing birth, which is what they were setting out to do. So thank you so much for being here. If you have any suggestions for what we should be talking about, or any suggestions for guests, or you want to put yourself forward, then please get in touch at cheryl@simplynatal.co.uk, or find me on Instagram or Facebook as Simply Natal, the Healing Birth Doula. Enjoy. I hope you're enjoying the podcast so far. It's a really scary thing doing a podcast, you know. I've had people listening from all over the world, and I can't even imagine why. But there you go. I hope people are finding it useful. What I wanted to do this episode about is about Caesarean. In particular, I wanted to ask the question, is a Caesarean birth always traumatic? And obviously it's very subjective, because if you've had a traumatic Caesarean birth, you might well feel as though there is no way that that birth could not be traumatic. What I find interesting is that sometimes when people talk about their experience of a Caesarean birth, they might say things like they had a lack of control or a loss of autonomy, and they felt deeply disappointed, traumatized, and like a failure. What I find interesting about that is that often that's also the language that people use when they have a traumatic vaginal birth, that they have a sense of a lack of control or autonomy, that they felt traumatized or deeply distressed or disappointed, and had a feeling of failure. So I think it would be easy to assume if you'd had an unplanned cesarean, for example, and having attempted a vaginal birth, that the reason why you feel like a failure is because you didn't give birth vaginally. But I think there's more to it than that, because people who give birth vaginally and are traumatized by their birth also often feel like failures too. So I don't think it's necessarily the mode of birth that causes that feeling, but there's lots of other things that might contribute to that feeling too. Now, of course, if you've spent your pregnancy dreaming of and visualising giving birth vaginally, whether it's your first baby, your second, or another pregnancy, then not having birth in that way can, of course, be deeply distressing. Let's have a look at what some people have said to me. So I've asked some people who are previous clients and followers what their traumatic cesarean was, had, or didn't have, caused them to feel traumatized by that experience. So the sorts of things that people said to me were feeling a loss of control and bodily autonomy, like they were the vessel and only the baby mattered, or the babies mattered. And so they didn't matter in the experience. That they were not listened to, and that came up more than once, that there was a lack of communication, people not telling them what was happening. And for some people also a sensory overload, as in lots of bright lights, lots of beeping sounds, lots of things happening to their body, and not being able to process all of that that's going on, especially when it's not explained well alongside it. A feeling of being alone and unsupported, not feeling as though the decision to go to cesarean was fully justified, and maybe it was not explained well, or maybe they felt as though all avenues were not explored to try and progress the labour before going to cesarean. Clearly, when people have had these things in their birth, whether that birth has ended in cesarean or not, it would be scary, it wouldn't feel safe, and it would be likely that a person having those experiences would feel traumatized by their birth. What I do want to say is that, what I didn't say before, actually, I meant to say, is that there's no doubt about the fact that a caesarean birth is major surgery. It is a big deal, and it is not to be taken lightly. It's not an easy way out, that's for sure. And physically speaking, it's always going to be traumatic. So to the body, it's a physical trauma. What I'm talking about specifically is psychological trauma, and trauma that's preventable with the right kind of support. So is a caesarean birth always traumatic? In some senses, yes. And we could go into conversations about what that experience is like for the baby even. But a caesarean birth does not have to be psychologically traumatic, whether it's a planned caesarean or an unplanned caesarean. It doesn't automatically mean that it would be traumatic. I'm not saying that it can't be. Of course, there will be situations where it's very, very difficult to protect against trauma, because it is a very difficult situation with a very with lots of perhaps medical complications. But we do know that the majority of caesareans that take place are not that level of emergency. Many are planned or elective. Others are non-emergency but unplanned, as in there's something that, or it's a maternal request during labour, or it's something that's happening that's indicating that, maybe we could think about doing it a different way. Sometimes it's a real emergency and baby needs to be born very quickly. And in those circumstances, the right support is really important, isn't it? To make people feel like they are safe and being well looked after. But yeah, a really difficult situation. For the majority of cases, it's not an actual, right now this baby needs to be born emergency. There's usually time to discuss options, to feel heard and have your wishes listened to, and having some sort of a caesarean birth plan could be useful for some people in those situations. So it might be that you're planning a physiological birth or home birth a birth centre birth, a vaginal birth of some description. And so the last thing that you want to think about is a caesarean birth. But having some idea of what it is that you would want, ideally, if it did come to that, might help some people to feel a bit more reassured. I understand why some people wouldn't want to do that, and that's okay. That's definitely a choice to be made individually. So, what do people say when they talk about their caesarean being an empowering experience? I'll tell you some of the things that people have said to me. They've said their caesarean was empowering because it was all on their terms, that every element was consented to and nothing was assumed. They've said, I loved my emergency caesarean. I felt cared for by empathetic staff and my dignity was kept intact. Someone else said, I made all the decisions. I had the power and the choice, and it helped me feel like I wasn't having anything done to me, which would have made it a traumatic experience. Choice, advocacy, autonomy, doing research beforehand to make sure they understood what an informed decision was, and having support and reassurance from their doula. So much of what people say to me about their caesarean experiences isn't actually about what happens during that caesarean experience. Most of the time, it's about the way they felt. It's about how they were spoken to. It's about what conversations were had and how choice was communicated. Having a sense of autonomy over their body and what happened to them, and feeling as though they could choose things and have those choices honoured as well. So I haven't really talked about my caesarean. So for anyone who doesn't know, my healing birth was a caesarean. So as much as I am usually supporting people to have physiological experiences of birth, because that is their choice, having not had good experiences before, they've chosen to go down that route. Not always. Sometimes people choose caesareans too. Usually when it's medically indicated, rather than it being a straight out choice from the beginning. It's a change of plan. And I suppose in some respects mine was too. It was a change of plan. It wasn't a caesarean all of the time. Part of me wanted to be reassured that I could have that choice, because having had a traumatic vaginal birth before, I needed to know that I had that choice. And I did know I had that choice, but I hadn't made that choice until much later on in pregnancy. But when I did have my planned caesarean, I did have all of those things that I've been talking about. I did have a sense of autonomy. I did feel listened to. I had a birth plan that was read by every single member of the team that day. And I talk about this sometimes with clients too. That particular part of that experience was really important for me, because I think there were about 6 different individuals who came to see me that morning with a copy of my plan in their hand, and they read it in front of me. They acknowledged all of the things, and they told me how important it was for them that they got this right for me. And that really mattered. That really felt really special, to feel as though they cared about what I needed and wanted from this experience. So it always makes me feel quite emotional to talk about, actually. a really important part of my experience, knowing that the whole team understood that because of my previous trauma, I really needed this experience to be positive. They explained everything to me. I felt part of all of it. And the most important part for me was when I met my baby and I got my skin to skin. And they honoured as much as they could the decisions that I'd made about what I wanted to happen. So I suppose what I'm saying is caesarean birth, no, it doesn't always have to be traumatic. But I'm in no way saying that your trauma is discounted if you do feel trauma attached to your birth by caesarean, because we know that trauma is in the eye of the beholder. And if you say it was traumatic, then it was. If you are planning for a caesarean birth, though, it might be important to decide on the things that you want and need rather than just going in and taking what's given, because it will give you a sense of autonomy. It will give you a sense of control. And that is important, as the examples I've given have demonstrated. If you have a change of plan towards the end of pregnancy, then rest assured that your birth experience can still be the things you need it to be, even though it's different than what you'd first planned. And if you're ever unsure about those decisions, then seek out support from somebody who can talk you through it gently and explain what your rights are and help you make a plan. That was part of my experience too. I had a really lovely hypnobirthing teacher who supported me through writing a caesarean plan, and I wouldn't have known to ask for the things that I asked for if not. I wouldn't have known that. So I'm very grateful I had that experience to be able to use that when it's necessary with my clients now. Caesarean birth doesn't always have to be traumatic, but it usually always requires some difficult recovery period, at least physically. We can cope physically better when we are mentally okay. So protecting our experience on a psychological level is really important for helping us to then recover better physically, because we can take more ownership over that recovery then. So yeah, what about your experiences? I'd love to hear about yours. What made your caesarean positive and empowering? What made your caesarean traumatic? Do you know? Have you thought about it? Have you explored it? Let me know if you've got anything that you'd like to share. And thank you so much for listening. I'll be back sometime soon with another episode. Take care. Bye bye.